Hello again, Guyana, and welcome to another edition of Conversations in State. I am Malika Ramsey. Thank you so very much for joining us. Well, for the last 2 weeks or so, you got rebroadcast programs, and I know those were very interesting because we got a lot of feedback. So we'd like to continue to thank you for supporting us. Today, we're going to take another look at the issue. Well, it's more than an issue, it's not just, a frivolous issue, but we're going to focus again on climate change. Now, for the first time on this program, we have Rear Admiral Gary Best, and we are having this conversation in light of the fact that he would have been the chairman of a committee. It's called the National Technical Needs Assessment Committee that would have wrapped up its works in August, the last week in August or so. So today he will be talking to us about why that that committee was very important to climate change. And that is a topic that we like to continue to focus on Conversations in State, because it is not, some of us brush it aside. And of course, Rear Admiral and I were talking earlier, and climate change, indeed, the topic of climate change, indeed, it's, to quote him, it's a jungle. So it's a lot of information out there, and we just like to keep the information coming to you. So this promises to be another informative half an hour. Rear Admiral Gary Best, thank you for coming, and of course, welcome to Conversations in State, sir.
Thank you also, Malika. Thank you for having me.
Great. Because we only have 30 minutes, I'd like to jump right into it. Let's talk about TNE, Technical Needs Assessment Project or Committee. What was the purpose of that in the context of climate change, and how important it is for Guyanese to be in the know where that is concerned?
Well, the Technology Needs Assessment Committee that was established was birthed out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. After the convention was established in 1992, what the developing countries recognized is that they weren't too sure about the technology that were required to mitigate or adapt to climate change. So that became a critical barrier. So what the United Nations did was to set up an entire mechanism that will allow specialists to go into countries and look and see what kind of technology they have available and identify and prioritize those technologies. In order for that to happen, they set up technology needs assessment committees in all of the developing countries and established chairs of those committees in the developing countries. So in the context of Guyana, I'm the chairman of the Guyana National Technology Assessment Committee, and then we sat over the period to do the work we were required to do under the guidance of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Okay, because you talked about the UN, of course it was set up a long time ago. Is Guyana late to this conversation, or are we right on time?
We are on time, because there are many more countries in the world who have not even commenced their technology needs assessment. So we're right on time. What is late is UN is late, but Guyana was not late. By the time they got to us, we were ready to move, and we spent close to a little over 2 years meeting once a month to advance the process of identifying the technologies that are required to adapt to climate change and mitigate climate change.
What does it mean, or if what should it mean for the average Guyanese?
Well, the purpose of the Technology Needs Assessment Committee was for us to identify the technologies that are required to adapt to climate change or mitigate climate change.
Yes.
And then to identify the barriers to those technologies. What are the barriers? And finally, to develop technology action plans to overcome those barriers. So what we've done is to identify the technologies that are required for us to mitigate climate change or adapt to climate change. We've also identified the barriers to those technologies, and we've also come up with technology action plans to overcome those barriers. So to the average Guyanese, it means that we've done the work required in the context of technology. It's not yet finished, but this project is finished.
I'm happy that you're saying that it's not yet finished. So what, in simple terms, what comes next?
Well, again, that is a policy issue.
Okay.
However, what should come next now is really the implementation of the technologies. But in order to implement the technology, having identified the technology and the barriers and the plans to overcome the barriers, we need now to develop what you call a full-fledged project documents for funding to bring the technology into Guyana so that the technology can be applied to the particular circumstance to either adapt to climate change or mitigate climate change.
Right.
Now that funding portal is available within the Green Climate Fund. So what Guyana has to do now is to take these technology action plans that we have developed and transition them into project documents that meet the standard of the Green Climate Fund. Put it into that pipeline through the National Designated Authority, which is the Minister of State, put it into the GCF pipeline, and then ask the GCF to fund those projects.
Right.
And then once they agree to fund them, then we'll bring the technology into the country and apply the technology either to mitigate or adapt to climate change.
A lot has happened since the conversation regarding climate change has gotten louder. I feel it has gotten loud in the last 2 or 3 years. A lot has happened. And as you rightly said, and as I mentioned to the viewers earlier, the topic of climate change really and truly is a jungle. And, there's a lot of parts and pieces that sometimes people can't necessarily fit together. Since we've started that conversation, since it's become louder, do you believe that Guyanese are in a more comfortable position in terms of understanding, what climate change is all about, how the roles that they can play, and not only the roles that they can play, but how they can benefit in whatever is happening regarding trying to mitigate the effects of climate change?
I think we're becoming more conscious of it.
Okay.
I don't think I can create a barometer of measurement, but I think Guyanese are becoming more conscious of it. And perhaps it's a good segue in be more conscious because the governing philosophy in the context of climate change really is being expressed through the Green State Development Strategy.
Okay.
And I think that quite a lot of work has been done on that strategy. There's a framework document on Green State Development Strategy, which is now I think out in the public domain for consultations. And that is a thematic document, and it carries 7 themes. And one of the themes is sustainable management of natural resources and energy transition. And one can link the technologies identified in the TNA to the Green State Development Strategy, because in order for the Green State Development Strategy to be successful, we're going to need to employ the right technology to mitigate climate change and to adapt to climate change. For example, in the TNA process, in the technologies we've identified, for mitigation, we've identified technologies to deal with the forestry sector and technologies to deal with the energy sector. On the adaptation side, we've identified technologies to deal with the agriculture sector, the water sector, and our low-lying coast. Those are 3 priority areas. Now, keep in mind, we had about 16 priority areas in almost for each of the sectors, but we had to narrow it down to 3, so those are the workable areas.
Okay.
So there's more work, because there are other technologies that didn't make the cut at this moment because we only were required to identify 3 of them, but they're still in the document. So there is a lot more work to be done because there are a lot of technologies, but I see the integration of the technologies that we've identified with the Green State Development Strategy, because that strategy will need technologies for it to be implemented, both on the hard side and the soft side. Because the technology could be hardware, which is hard, or it could be what we call software, which is essentially soft. It could be human development, it could be a physical thing, it could be an ideational activity. So it's not necessarily a hard technology. It doesn't have to be a bulldozer. It doesn't have to be a rainwater harvesting system. It could be simply human development, capacity building. That could be the technology also.
I'm happy you talked about human development capacity building, because when we're having these conversations, it's always, again, coming back to the average Guyanese, it's always important to ensure that they understand how they can benefit and so on. And now I'd like to talk specifically, and I know you had some sentiments regarding the agriculture sector is big in Guyana, and sometimes, you hear people talking about, because we have this newly found oil industry, we don't want the agriculture sector, the agriculture industry to be neglected. But if you can specifically pinpoint how an average, maybe a farmer, an average person working, functioning, operating in the agriculture sector and the other sectors can benefit. Let's talk about that.
But for the agriculture sector, I think what is important for the agriculturist, the farmer out there, is that we've identified some technologies to assist him.
Okay.
And the most important one we think we've identified is early warning systems. This is early warning weather system. So if our farmers can have early warning weather systems, it allows them to plan beforehand for an impending not necessarily disaster, impending climate intervention, which perhaps could be heavy rainfall, perhaps flooding. And also we have systems to allow him to understand what sort of crop diversification he can go into, depending on what kind of climatic intervention, climatic variation, or climatic change is impending. So all the warning systems came out, and that came out with a natural consultation with the fieldwork done by the sector working groups through the 2 years that we sat. So that's one important area in the agriculture sector. And I'm glad you mentioned oil industry, because we're talking about the oil sector. We have to talk about an oil sector and an oil economy. So we want to make sure that we keep the Guyana economy as broad as possible. I think that's what the Green State Development Strategy wants to do. Not to have an oil economy, but to have an oil sector within the Guyanese economy. So I agree with you that some people might wonder how we're dealing with agriculture and dealing with oil at the same time. Well, in my humble opinion, I think it's the proceeds from the oil sector we use to drive the agricultural sector, because at the end of the day, I think food and water will continue to be the two most important ingredients for the sustenance of life in the future.
And you don't necessarily see the oil industry having an effect on other industries, and for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to focus on climate change and agriculture and so on. You don't see it taking from those industries and taking from the fact that the mitigating the effects of climate change needs to be ongoing work. Do you see in any way, feel in any way that oil and focus on oil can take anything away from that?
Oh, that's a very, very interesting question, because it depends on the point of view, from what perspective you look at it. Okay. If you're looking at climate change, which is what we want to mitigate and adapt to climate change as a nation and as a requirement as a member of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. For mitigation, we want to decarbonize. That is, we want to reduce the amount of carbon we emit into the atmosphere. And to adapt, we want to ensure that we adapt to the climate variation. So those are two things we require to do. So if we have an oil industry, naturally we're going to produce greenhouse gases because we're into the oil industry. So one will ask the question, well, are you really mitigating if you are contributing? The simple answer is yes or no, because once we look at the economy and we do a compensation within the economy, then we could do what we call a set-off. We do set-off, then we decarbonize one part of the economy, and then we emit in the next part of the economy. So it's a set-off, because climate change essentially is a business now, and that's why the economics of climate change is so important. So yes, I think they can go side by side, but we have to ensure that our footprint, our carbon footprint, does not increase. And that may be a bit, for some people, tricky, but I think we can do it. Because we can transition to electric vehicles, for example, and if you transition to electric-powered vehicles, it means that reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, that set-off can go towards the oil industry, so we can maintain our carbon footprint. It's a question of how we decide to look at it, how we decide to manage it.
Okay, great. Viewers, if you're now tuning in, of course, today my conversation is with Rear Admiral Gary Best, and we're talking climate change and to some extent the environment and so on. Rear Admiral, I know previously you played a major role in terms of, again, and when we talk about a green economy in Guyana, one of the tongues we focused on would have been Bartica, and you played a major role in that. Do you believe that not only the government of Guyana, but our state, our country, would we have been able to achieve contributions to a great green state, the not just the strategy, but a green state, using Bartica as a model tongue?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that for me, for people to understand, it would take maybe, I would say, 10 to 20 years to develop a model green tongue.
Okay.
It's a process. It's going to take some time. I think Bartica as a model is on the right track, and the pace at which it goes is a function of the inputs that it gets from the state, and also from the relation between Bartica and the private sector. I think it's on the right path. There is an overall plan for the development of Bartica as a model town. At the same time, you have to have concurrent activity. We're not going to wait 20 years before the model becomes a model for the country. So I think it's a concurrent. There are two concentric circles. One is one surrounding Bartica as a model town, and the country itself is still moving towards in that green direction. Green economy essentially means that you want to reduce the amount of carbon that you emit into the atmosphere. You want to reduce that. So you can look at it as decarbonizing the economy. So it's, you can look at it as maintaining your standing forests
Understood.
But I like the fact, I like to look at it from the perspective of decarbonizing the economy. Make sure that we're not emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere unless it is absolutely necessary. And keep in mind also, Malika, we need the greenhouse gases. What we don't need is so much greenhouse gases. We can't live in this planet without the greenhouse
Without the
gases.
greenhouse, yes.
It's just we don't need so much to create
This is
this
just a
imbalance.
balance. Yeah.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
what we require.
Have we, and again, I know this is policy and you can't necessarily answer everything based on policy, but this is a lot of information, and we always like to talk about the youth and the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that. Have we done enough, or are we doing enough to ensure that the information that you are giving here and that so many persons working in this sector would have put out there, are we doing enough to get it into our school system, our education system?
I think there's a recommendation for it to become part of the school system, to become a subject to be taught in school. I think that's a recommendation. My suspicion is that going to come out from the Green State Development Strategic Interventions within the public consultations. I don't see it as a problem going into the school system to become a subject to be taught, because that will attend to one of the concepts within the Green State Development Strategy, that it must be inter and intra-generational. So I don't think we can speak of inter and intra-generational and don't have it being taught in the schools. So I see it getting into the school system. How it is packaged becomes maybe the issue to deal with. But I hope that it does go into the school and it is taught as a subject for all the school children to understand what it means. And therefore, we can simplify it for them. But quite a lot of young people understand, I have found, understand what climate change is all about and understand what adaptation is all about. They do understand. They have a sense of it. We need to simplify it even a bit more for them to understand.
Yeah, well, it needs to be simplified for people like me to understand, but I'd like to think I'm getting there. Again, this is a lot. Best practices. In all of this, whether it be the TNA, the GSDS of itself, is there a need to use maybe best practices of whether it be other developing countries or developed countries that would have taken on this task of climate change, the whole topic of climate change, mitigation, and so on?
I think there are best practices out there. There are many countries that are pursuing. I think Rwanda is a very good example. I think we should look at Rwanda. And there's a lot of examples, a lot of leadership from the top. Rwanda has a top-down sort of approach towards its own economy. So there are best practices out there. And I think Guyana is at the right time in history to go green. And if you check the Constitution of Guyana, there was a lot of thought that went into the Constitution of Guyana. The Constitution of Guyana sets the framework for the Green State Development Strategy. There are articles in the Constitution that speak specifically to the environment, that we as Guyanese have a responsibility to protect the environment and to sustainably manage our resources. That is in our Constitution. So the Green State Development Strategy is on a solid framework, is on a solid constitutional footing. So I like to say that when I have my light conversations with people, that is not something hairy-fairy. It's in the Constitution. What the government has done is to give it a form, and it's now called Green State Development Strategy, but it's already in the Constitution. So there are best practices out there. I mentioned Rwanda.
Yes.
And Guyana could learn from Rwanda. We can learn from even more developed countries. But if we don't understand what the green economy is, that's what I mentioned before, if you're going green, and you can go back to perhaps what we call the factors of production. Land, labor, and capital were the essential factors of production. And then we added the environment. From the time we added the environment to that, we went into more like environmental economics. When we added the decarbonizing of the environment, we started to transition to more green economics, that we started to decarbonize. Because what we did is that we used land, labor, and capital, and we forgot the environment. And we ended up with this climate negative.
Yes.
Now we've added the environment to the factors of production, and we recognize the environment is so broad. We had to now segment it. So within the environment, you talk about ecology, ecological development, biodiversity. All those are elements of the environment. And there are some scholars who are adding distributive justice, democratic justice, climate justice. All those are factors we're adding now to this whole issue of what are the factors of production. So if you look at the many factors that are being added, they're much more than the essential three, but they all fit, and they're all subsets of the environment. And that's why it becomes a jungle, that's why it becomes like a maze of activity.
Yes.
But all we're really doing is trying to protect this environment, ensure that this environment is here to benefit us and benefit generations to come. And if the students, the children understand only that they have to protect the environment for the next generation, then we would have done our job.
Oh, great, and I'm sure they're on their way to that. I'm happy that you talked about the Constitution, and it made me remember something, and I'd like to take you back in time just for a little bit. Now, we always hear about the time when Guyana was the breadbasket of the Caribbean. Was that a time when climate change was an issue for us? Because I mean, in about like 5 or 10 years ago, we started talking about getting Guyana back to that time when we were the breadbasket of the Caribbean, and now the conversation indeed has somewhat switched to green state and climate change and so on. Back in that time when Guyana was the breadbasket of the Caribbean, was climate change, or would it ever, come to mind that climate change would eventually be an issue and probably affect us or stop us from being the breadbasket of the Caribbean?
Well, I'm not a historian on this issue. I think I could say Guyana being a breadbasket of the Caribbean. I seem to remember that Guyana was touted as a country that ought to be the breadbasket of the Caribbean. I don't know if the facts support that we were really the breadbasket of the Caribbean. That we were actually exporting our food to the Caribbean, because there are a lot of issues, a lot of challenges there with Trinidad and with Jamaica. But we were always set and still set to be the breadbasket of the Caribbean. I know our governments in the past have always held agricultural posts within CARICOM. We've tried to push our products out in the Caribbean because we have a good agricultural infrastructure. In the context of where we anticipated climate change affecting that, which is what is happening now with our farmers.
Yep.
Climate change is a slow onset. It doesn't happen quickly. It takes years to realize that the climate is changing. I think we now know that the days are hotter.
Yes.
So we're saying that. We're not going to change our lexicon. The days are hotter, full stop. It took us decades to come to the conclusion that the days are hotter. But in fact, the days are hotter. The rainfall is more torrential now. The downpours are greater. So we're now going to say the downpours are greater. In August, we're having downpours and we're having hot days. So I think we're slowly accepting that climate change is it. Did we predict it? No. But here's the thing, Malika. We can now predict it for the future. We now know what is likely to happen, reasonably likely to happen in the future. And therefore, we can put systems in place to ensure that our farmers are protected from the onset of climate change, because he or she can identify what are the likely consequences and plan for it. That our infrastructure, as we go ahead and develop an infrastructure, we take into context of climate change. That our buildings that we set up, we take into context climate change. So we can look at how we set up our buildings. How do we angle the buildings to take in natural sunlight, for example, so that we use more natural sunlight and less energy. So we can do that. How do we deal with energy conservation? How do we deal with energy leakage within the economy? So those are things we can do because we now have knowledge, we now have information. What sort of bylaws we need to have coming out of our municipalities to protect current buildings and future buildings? What building codes we need to add to ensure that the future buildings are climate proof, so that we don't have energy leakage. So we have a lot of information now that we can use to put into our laws, bylaws, and policies, which I think will help us on this journey to adapt to and mitigate climate change.
All right. Rear Admiral, this has certainly been an interesting conversation, but even before I begin to wrap up our conversation, and again, you talked about it being a jungle. I don't know how much at this point you can talk about in terms of the GSDS, but I'd like you to see how much of it you can scrape off even before we begin to wrap up our conversation. And of course, viewers, just to remind you, GSDS meaning Green State Development Strategy, and we touched on it a few months ago. Rear Admiral, your thoughts and sentiments on the GSDS, and again, it's really big. I don't know how much you can say in maybe about 4 minutes or so.
My understanding of the GSDS is the pathway for Guyana's development for the future. It's based on 7 thematic areas. And some of the most important thematic areas are sustainable development of our natural resources, energy transition and transition to clean energy, human resource development is a significant component, And those themes are set on some very important pillars.
Mm-hmm.
So the Green State Development Strategy, obviously we're transition to a Green State Development, we're transition to a Green State Development Plan for Guyana. So Guyana's future development pathway is linked or anchored within the Green State Development Strategy. Mm-hmm. That is out now for public. I think they're wrapping up the public consultations. Mm-hmm. How does it go forward? I'm not sure what is the plans of government, but one anticipates will be a broader discussion, a parliamentary discussion, okay, a national discussion with it for total buy-in. So in that context, I think the Green State Development Strategy built on the low carbon development strategy. The low carbon development strategy was a single solution to climate change. The Green State Development Strategy is a multiple solution to climate change. So it's really essentially built on it. So what this government has done is to look at a multiple solution to climate change, and not only one based on forests, but one based not only on forests, one based on forests, one based on transportation sector, energy sector, forest sector, agriculture sector, and all those sectors we want to ensure that they are developed in such a manner that it doesn't harm the environment, but at the same time it produces goods and services for the development of people, and also to provide what we like to call the good life.
Okay, great. And that's a perfect note for us to end on, the good life. Viewers, if you're now tuning in, of course, you missed a great one, but as usual, it will be on YouTube and the other social sites and so on. This would have been Conversations in State program, and I would have been talking with Rear Admiral Gary Best. He was the chairman of the TNA committee, that's the Technical Needs Assessment Committee, regarding climate change and so on. And of course, you know, Rear Admiral would have been wrong in terms of a number of climate change issues and environmental matters, and I know you'll continue to see him there, because really and truly climate change is and should be everyone's business. Of course, I am Malika Ramsey. I want to thank you very much for tuning in, and I invite you to join us again next time. This has been Conversations in State.